Administration tasks in Linux. In this nugget, we're going to discuss the administration of user accounts and user groups in Linux. We'll cover the basic commands necessary to administer users and groups, and we'll also talk about commands for altering file permissions and user and group ownership of files. I'll also walk you through a common scenario where you want to set up sharing of files amongst members of a special project. So let's get to work. All right, well, let's start our discussion of basic system administration tasks in Linux by talking about administration of user accounts. So we already know something about user accounts in the fact that we log into one every time we log into the system, and my account name is Perry. All right, and you can always see who you're logged in as with the whoami command. It's also written in my prompt. If your prompt doesn't display that, you can always determine that by typing whoami. And we also know about another special account called the root account that we use to do privileged tasks in the system. And the su command is a switch user command, and if you don't specify a user to switch to, it assumes that you want to switch to the root user. So I hit enter here, I can type in my root password, and now I am logged in as the root user. All right, and now I have special privileges to accomplish certain things. And we've already talked about that you shouldn't log into the system as the root user. You shouldn't, when you have that login screen, you shouldn't type root and the root password, even though that would work perfectly well. You just shouldn't do that for security reasons. You should always log in as a normal user, and then when you need to accomplish some privileged task, you should switch over to be the root user. All right, so let's talk about some information about user accounts and where this information is kept. All of the user accounts on the system are noted in the etc password file. So let's print that out to the screen. All right, and each line in etc password represents an account on the system. Now there's the line for the root account. Down here is the line for the Perry account. Okay, but there's all these other accounts too. A lot of these you can't even log into directly. These accounts are only there to own some particular service, like the LP service, that's the printing daemon, the mail service, that's the mail daemon. FTP takes care of the FTP services on the system. Okay, so this just makes it so that it owns this particular service. These accounts own a particular service, but you can't log into them. So there's only really one account that you have to keep track of, and there's only one account that hackers are going to be trying to get into, and that's the root account. So that's why you should always have a good password for the root user. All right, let's talk about what each of these fields means in the etc password file. All right, so the first field here, and the fields are delimited by colons. So the first field here is just the account name. The next field is the password. If you see a bunch of gobbledygook here on your system, that's the encrypted form of the password. If you see an X, that means that your system is using shadowed passwords, and every current version of Linux that I'm aware of uses shadowed passwords by default. And what that means is that there's another file out there called etc shadow, and in that file is where the encrypted password is kept. So that just adds like an extra level of security to things. All right, the next item here in each line is the user identification number. For root, it's 0. For Perry, it's 500. If I added more user accounts to the system, they're going to get user ID like 501, 502, 503, and so on. Okay, then the next field here is the group identification number, and then the next field is the like the name for the user. So I should have my full name here, but I just typed Perry. All right, then the next field here is the home directory for the user, and the last field is the default shell for the user. Okay, so that's what all the information stands for in here. Just as a side note, the computer likes to keep track of things as numbers, right? So the user identification number is 500. So internally, the computer is keeping track of, Perry as user 500. Humans like to think of things in terms of names, right? So I'd like to think of my account as being the Perry account, right? Same for the group number. Internally, the computer is using identification numbers for my group membership, whereas I think of the names of the group, and the group that I'm a part of, the 100 group, is the users group. Okay, we can see that information by going to the etc group file and printing that out to the screen, and you'll see here that the users group has identification number 100. You can also see an X here in this Etsy group file, and that is representing the password for a group. So you can assign passwords to groups just like you can assign passwords to users. So when you change into a particular group, then there will be a there can be a password associated with that, and the X here represents that that password is stored in a separate file, and for group passwords, it's stored in Etsy G shadow. So let's talk about how to add a new user account to the system. And to do that, you can use the user add command. If you give the capital D option to user add, you'll see the set of defaults that comes with every account. All right, so the default group for every account is group number 100, or the user's account. The default location for home directories is under /home. Inactive set to -1 means the account will be active by default. It's kind of a double negative. -1 means it's not inactive. There is no expiration dates for accounts by default. The default shell is the bash shell, and the default skeleton directory is Etsy skell. All right, let's take a look at Etsy skell and see what's in there. What is the skeleton directory? All right, if I do a listing on the Etsy skell directory, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff in here. All right, a lot of these things that start with dots are user configuration files, and that's pretty much what this Etsy skell directory is composed of. So basically, this is the bare bones stuff that you want every user to have when they first have an account. All right, so some basic stuff is configured for every user on the system, and you don't have to copy these files over manually. They will be automatically put in the user's home directory when you create a new user account. So if you want to change something that every user gets, you can just change, the bash RC file in Etsy skell. Then every new account that you create will have that change reflected in it in its home directory right from the very beginning. All right, so let's do a user add. If you give the -M option to user add, that says create the user's home directory. And by creating the user's home directory, you'll get all this stuff that's in Etsy skell. All right, and I'll just give the user a name Alice. All right, so I'll hit enter here. And now if we go to the home Alice directory and do a listing there, you'll see the exact same stuff in here that you saw in Etsy skell, word for word. All right, so now the user Alice has an account on the system, and Alice has a whole bunch of files in her home directory, some of these basic configuration files. Now Alice still can't log in yet, and that's because I didn't assign Alice a password. Okay, so one thing I could have done in this user add command, I could have said -M. I could have also said -P and typed a password for Alice and then given the Alice username. So this would be Alice's password when she logs in. I didn't do that, so another way that I can assign a password for Alice as the root user, I can say password Alice, hit enter, and it says type a password for Alice. Okay, so let me type a password here. Let me type another password. And now the password's changed. Now Alice can log into the system with this password that I just created for her, and then she'll be set into her home directory and have the privileges that normal users have. Now let's talk about groups in Linux. We've already seen that the user Perry and the user Alice were put into the group users by default. Let me stop being the root user here and go back to being the user Perry. And let's talk about what groups are good for and how we could administer groups as a system administrator. So if you type the word groups, the command groups, you'll see all the groups that you are a member of. So the user Perry here is a member of all of these groups. We already know about the users group. What are all these other groups for? Well, let's just talk about the audio group, and these other groups are kind of the same way. The audio group is a group that has been given permissions over audio devices in the system. So like the CD player and the speakers and things like that. All right. So what we're doing with groups here is we're controlling access to certain devices in the system. The people that we want to allow have control over the CD player, the speakers, etc., are put into the audio group. So if we look at the file Etsy group again, and we scroll up a little bit here, you'll see there's the audio group. It's group number 17, and the user Perry is part of this group. All right. Notice that Alice is not part of this group. So Alice cannot have access to, the CD player and the speakers and things like that. All right, so as the system administrator, you have to decide, what your policy is going to be on adding people to which groups and what people should have control over. Okay, if Alice is a remote user to this system, solely a remote user, she never sits down at the console and works on this computer directly, then it's probably fine to leave her out of this group. She shouldn't have access to the CD player and the speakers, otherwise she can blast something over Perry's speakers that he doesn't want to hear, okay? So, but if Alice does sit down at this terminal occasionally, then Alice should be a member of this audio group. Okay, so say we want to add Alice to this audio group. How do we do that? Well, one way that we can do that is with the gpassword command, gpasswd. Now, this seems like an odd command to alter the groups, but this is one of the commands that you can use to alter group membership. You can also set passwords with this command and so on. So if I want to add Alice to this group, I use the -A option for add. I say Alice, and then I say audio. So this says add Alice to the audio group. Okay, now I just noticed here that I'm back to being the normal user Perry, so I won't be allowed to execute this command. So I'll hit enter here. It'll say permission denied. Let me switch back over to being the root user and execute that command again as the root user. Okay, so gpassword -A Alice audio, and then I hit enter. Now it says adding user Alice to the group audio. If we look at the Etsy group file again and scroll up here, you'll see now that Perry and Alice are both members of the group audio. Okay, good. So gpassword is a way that I can add a user to a group. I can also delete a user from a group. If I wanted to take Alice out of that group, I would say gpassword -D Alice audio, and that would delete Alice from the audio group. All right, so gpassword is a way that I can alter group membership, and like I said, this allows you to do things like share devices in this case in Linux. Well, you can also use groups in Linux to do a sort of file sharing. Okay, we're in Perry's home directory here. Let's do a long listing of Perry's home directory. And you can see information here about permissions and ownerships of all the files listed on the right-hand column of all the files in Perry's directory. All right, so let's just take one example here and let's talk about some commands we can use to alter file permissions and look at what kinds of permissions the user and the group has over these files. So here we're talking about the file sports1.txt in our example. This column here represents the user owner of that file. This column represents the group owner of that file. And then these letters over here represent the permissions that the user and the group and the rest of the system have over this file sports1.txt. All right, so the very first column here represents whether the file is a directory or not. If you see a D there, that means the file is a directory. If you don't see a D, that means it's a regular file. Then the next three characters represent the users or the user's permission. Okay, when I'm talking about the user here, I'm talking about Perry. So the owner's permission for this file sports1.txt is read and write. That means that Perry can read the file, Perry can write the file, make changes to the file, delete the file, things like that. Okay, the next three characters represent the group's permissions to the file. And the group that we're talking about here is the users group. And the users group has read permissions on this file. So what that means is that anyone in the users group, that's Perry, that's Alice, that's anyone else who gets added to the users group, can come in and read this file, but they don't have any write permission to this file. They can't edit it, they can't change it, they can't delete it, they can't do anything to it that alters the file at all. All right, so that's the group ownership of the file, and then the next three characters represent the rest of the system's ownership of the file, the others. And the others have no permission on this file. They can't read it, they can't write it, and so on. Okay, so that's the permissions that we have set up for sports1.txt. Now let's talk about how to alter those permissions with the changed command. The changed command is a command that we can use to alter the permissions on the files. All right, so let's just take this file sports1.txt and let's alter the permissions. Say I want to make it so that everyone in the group users has write permissions to this file. How can I do that? Well, one way that changed has a few different forms, and one of the forms I call the plus-minus form, and that's sort of the easiest one for new people to pick up. And the way that you can do that is you can say G plus W for sports1.txt. All right, what this says is that I'm adding write permission for the group to this file sports1.txt. So if I hit that, then I say ls minus l sports1.txt, we'll see now the new set of permissions for the group is read write. So now anyone in the group users can come in and alter this file, they can delete the file, and so on. Say I want to make it so that people in the group users can't do anything to this file. They can't read it or write it. How would I do that with change mod? Well, there we would use the minus form, and we would say g minus rw sports1.txt. There we go. And I do that, and then I say ls minus l sports1.txt, and now you can see that the group has no permissions over this file. They can't read it or write it. By default, most of the times in Linux, the group has read permissions over the files in your home directory. So anyone in the group users can come into your directory and read your files. If you don't want that to be done, then you can do change mods here, like we just did, and take away permissions from the group for all of your files. Now, it's conceivable that you want a group of people on the system to be able to share files, but you don't want that to be like the whole users group. You just want it to be a collection of people that are working on some special project, perhaps. And maybe you want it so that the people working on the special project can read and write the files, that are being shared, but nobody else on the system can look at these files. So let's talk about how to set up a situation like that. Well, the first thing is, as the root user, you need to add a group to the system. Let's just add a group named Special, for lack of a better name. So I'll add the group Special, and if we look at the etc group file, you'll see now that Special has been added, and it's group identification number 500. Not that you care what the identification number is, but that's how it's been set up. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to create a directory that Special will own, and Special will have read and write permissions to this directory. So let's create the directory under Home, for lack of a better place. You can create it wherever you want, but I'm going to create it under Home, and I'll just call the directory Special as well. Now let's take a look at the permissions on this directory Special. Okay, so there's my directory Special. The owner is root, the group owner is root, and here's the permissions for the owner and the group and the others in the system. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change over the group ownership of this directory to the special group. And the way that I do that is with the change group command. So I can say change group special for the special directory. So I'll do that. Let me do another ls minus l, and now you can see the group that owns this directory Special is the special group. All right, now what's next? Next, I want to take away read and execute permissions for others. I don't want anyone else in the system to be able to enter this directory and read files in this directory. So I'm going to take away read and execute permissions for the others. Read and execute permissions on a directory means you can go into the directory, you can list files in the directory, and you can read files in the directory by default. All right, so I want to take these away, so I'll do that with the change mod command. I'll say others minus rx for the special directory. So that's taking away read and execute permissions for the others on the special directory. Again, another ls minus l, and we can see now that the others have no permissions over this directory. We're almost there. Also notice that the group only has read and execute permissions for this directory. So anyone in the group Special will be able to go into this directory and read files and list files, but they won't be able to write files. So we need to change that as well. We need to give the group write permissions to this directory Special. One more ls minus l, and now it's set up just the way we want. The group has read, write, and execute permissions for this directory, and the group ownership is this group that we just created. One last thing I have to do here is add a user to this group Special so that I can demonstrate how to go about going into this directory and creating files and so on. So I'm going to use the gpassword command, and I'm going to add Perry to the special group. And now you can see that's been accomplished. Now I want to stop being the root user, and I want to go back to being the user Perry. I want to go up to the home directory, do a listing. I can see the directory Special. Let me go into this directory Special. What do I get? I get a permission denied error. How come? If we look at the etc group file, you'll see that Perry's in this group. All right, Perry right there is in the special group. So how come Perry can't cd into the special directory? Well, that's because if you look at the groups command for Perry, Special is not in that group. How do we get special into that group? I type new group special. And this is the way that you can change into a new default group so that when I go into that directory and I create files and things like that, they will be owned by the special group. So I'll type new group special. Let me type groups again, and you can see now special is at the head of this list, which means it's my default group. So any files that I create will have group ownership special. If I do an exit out of, after I type new group special, if I type exit, then I'll go back to sort of this group setup so that users is my default group again. All right, but for the time being, special is now my default group, so I can go into the directory special. One note here that I just forgot to mention is that this new group special command could have a password associated with it. The gpassword command that we use to add and remove people from groups, we can also use that to set up a password on a particular group. And then when someone types new group special, they would have to also supply a password. So that's just like an extra level of security. If someone sat down at my terminal while I was away and they typed new group special, they would then be a member of the special group. They could get into the directories and read the files that we don't want normal users to be able to read. And so we could put a password on there as an extra level of precaution. Now that I'm in the directory special, let me just create a junk file. All right, so I'm just going to type some junk here and save the file, and let's do a listing on this file junk to see what permissions it has. Well, you can see that the group special has ownership, group ownership over the file junk, and that's because I did this new group special command. Notice also that the user Perry has read and write permissions, the group special has read permissions, and others also have read permissions. Now, don't be worried that others have read permissions over this file junk. We already took the others permissions away from the directory. We took away the read and execute permissions for others on the directory special, so they can't look at files in here no matter what the permissions are on these files. They can't even see files in this directory at all. Now, it's up to you in your particular situation whether you want to allow the group special to be able to write this file. Maybe this is a report that Perry wrote that he wants to share with everybody in the group special, but he just wants them to be able to read it. All right, so the default permissions are good, but maybe in some instances he also wants them to be able to edit it. Well, then he's got to pull the change mod command and say add write permissions to this file junk. And if we look now anyone in the group special can read and write this file. Now what I want to do is just demonstrate that these permissions actually work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit out of here. Let me switch over to be the user Alice. So I have to type in Alice's password. And now, who am I? I'm the user Alice. Let me do a listing here. I can see the directory special from the /home directory, but if I try to go into that directory, I get a permission denied. If I try to list the files in that directory, I get a permission denied. If I try to print out a file in that directory because I'm telepathic and I know what the name of a file is in that directory, I still can't do that. Permissions denied. And all of these are permission denied because we took away the read and execute permissions on the directory special. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget here on administration of users and groups and file permissions in Linux. And let's just talk about some of the commands that we learned and also some of the other commands that we didn't learn that fall into the same family. If you need to use these commands, just check out the man pages. Their use is pretty easy, actually. So we talked about the user add command for adding a new user to the system. There's also a user delete and a user modify command. So this is for deleting a user, and this is for modifying user information, like changing a user's default shell or changing their username or something like that. Then we talked about a group add command. So this command we use to add a new group to the system. And the group that we added was the special group. That was for a group of people that were all working on some special project so that they could share files. Similarly, there's a group delete command and a group mod command, just like for the user add, user delete, and user mod commands. So we can delete groups or modify groups with these commands. The gpassword command allows us to set a password for a group. We didn't use it that way. We used options to the gpassword command to add or remove users from a particular group. And don't forget about the new group command. That's a command that changes your default group over to some other group so that files that you create will be owned by the group that you just moved into with the new group command. Then we talked about commands to change file permissions. Change mod allowed us to change the read, write, execute permissions for files and directories. Change group allows us to change the group ownership of files. And there's also a change own command that we didn't use, but this allows the root user to change the actual owner of the file. Remember, there's a bunch of important files in the Etsy directory to keep track of. The password file, where passwords and account information is kept. The group file, where information about groups and identification numbers for groups and membership to groups, where that's kept. The shadow file is a password file, is where encrypted versions of the passwords from Etsy password are kept. And then the gshadow file is where encrypted versions of group passwords are kept. All right. If your system is not using shadowed passwords, you can use the commands pw conversion or group conversion, grp conversion, to convert over to a shadowed system. So if you run the pw conversion, that will take the encrypted forms of passwords out of the password file, put an X there in the field, and then put the encrypted versions of the passwords over into the shadow file. And this is recommended. And like I said, nearly every version of Linux that's out there, every current version of Linux that's out there is using shadowed passwords. But if it's not on your system and you want to convert over to that, you can do that with these commands. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.